So this week we are working on the idea of the self, as well as what we call social cognition, right? Which is our ability to think about ourselves and to think about ourselves in relationship to other people and social contexts. And so one of the big ideas we are working with is that we spend a lot of time and effort as human beings trying to protect our sense of self. And so this short screencast is about attribution theory, which is one of the ways that we do that. So we'll be looking at how do we construct explanations of our own behavior and others' behaviors in a way that protects our sense of self. Before we get to that, I wanted to just point out a couple of very cool biological things about social psychology. So we kind of know instinctively that humans are inherently social animals, and neuroscience backs this up. So one thing you can think about, right, is the fact that our social behaviors enable our survival. And so therefore, our brains are wired to prioritize social cognition, right? Um, for human beings, living in groups tends to provide evolutionary advantages. You can better protect yourself from predators. You can construct more complicated or heavier lodgings. Try to imagine like building a log cabin all by yourself. That's pretty hard, but living in groups, right, allows you to produce some things that you can't on your own. But in order for human beings to be able to take advantage of living in groups, we need social skills and ability to recognize other people's intentions, ideas, to communicate, and to work together in order to make this happen. On the brain wiring note, scientists have found that when we are doing nothing, our brains tend to revert to activating our networks for social cognition almost reflexively, almost automatically. Um, we have different networks in our brains that relate to kind of abstract or logical reasoning. And those are different networks from the networks of neurons that do our social processing. And so again, some of the studies that are done this way have people, working on particular tasks that require those logical networks to be active. And as soon as people finish, automatically what happens is those social networks start kind of working overtime. And this means that people are thinking about themselves in relationship to other people, how we compare to others, etc. What's really interesting is that researchers have even documented this phenomenon among newborn babies who haven't yet really developed much of a social world, but those brain networks are primed to be super active. Okay. And when you think about it, babies need social skills too, right? Crying is a social skill. Making a cute face that gets somebody to pick you up is a social skill, right? We need social skills to survive as human beings. Something else that's really interesting is that physical pain and social pain have overlapping neural pathways. And this takes place in a structure called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, or the DACC. Um, this, I think, again, intuitively makes sense, but it's cool that the science backs us up. If you think about some moment of social pain in your life, be it large or small, if you go back to middle school and think about some social exclusion or rejection that really stung, um, sometimes you can almost feel it in a physical way, right? And again, our brain pathways, the fact that those pain pathways overlap and run very close to each other suggests that social pain really is almost a physical experience. One last thought about this, just to remind us of something we've already talked about. We've talked about mirror neurons, those structures in our brains that enable both humans and other primates to understand the actions and intentions of others. And this is part of the mechanism by which we can look at somebody else, watch their actions, watch their facial expressions, and have some understanding of what might be going on inside their minds. we talked about this when we talked about the monkeys who had been wired up in their brains to different electrodes, and as they watched a researcher pick up a piece of food, the same neurons would fire in the monkey's brains as would fire when the monkey picked up its own piece of food. And research has borne this out, that humans also do have these kinds of networks. And again, this is a kind of biological building block that helps us be social animals. Okay, so all that fun science stuff aside, on to a little bit of what we call attribution theory. You might just grab a piece of paper just to do a tiny bit of jotting. Here we go, okay? Like, imagine a scenario. You're driving on the freeway and another car blows past you going way over the speed limit and cuts you off, causing you to slam on your brakes. What's your immediate reaction? Write down like one or two things. Okay, here's another scenario. Now, I'd like you to remember and just hold in your mind for a second the last time you broke the speed limit. Not like you were going 5 over, but like you were really speeding. Why were you speeding? Take just 10 seconds and jot it down. So if you're like many of us, you might have come up with some of the following reactions. On the why they speed side, what a jerk, you pick your choice of expletive. What a rude person. Don't they care about anyone else's safety? Now, if you're like many people, on the why I was speeding side, you might have done something like the following. I had to get to school and I was really late. I was distracted and didn't notice. My sister did this once. She told the police officer who pulled her over that she was playing the alphabet game and she had just spotted the letter P and she sped up to see it. You might have really had to go to the bathroom. Or maybe you just felt like having fun, but you knew it was safe and it was not a big deal. Okay? These are typically the kinds of patterns of answers that I see when we do this exercise together in class. So something to notice about these is that the why they speed side tends to attribute the other person's behavior to personal characteristics. What a jerk is a label about who that person is, right? What a rude person is what kind of person they are, or a person who is careless about other safety. When you look at our own behavior side, what tends to happen is that our behaviors get attributed to something about the situation, right? I was late for school, so it's not I was a careless person, but there was a situation that made me engage in this behavior. I was distracted, right? Something in my surroundings made me not notice what I was doing. I looked at the situation and I made a determination, but I'm not a careless person, right? There's a difference between how we tend to explain other people's behavior and how we tend to explain our own behavior. This is the basis of what researchers call attribution theory. Okay? Psychologists have identified 2 types of attributions that we use, and we just saw those on the last slide, right? Situational attributions explain our behaviors in terms of the situation or context. On the other hand, dispositional attributions, what we saw on the why were they speeding side, explain behaviors in terms of a person's enduring characteristics or dispositions. So you might think about how you might make those different types of attributions to explain your behavior in ways that make you feel good about yourself. If you go back to the why you were late for school, well, it certainly sounds better to say, well, the situation made me speed than I am a careless and rude person. Nobody wants to believe that about themselves, right? And so we tend to look for ways to explain our behaviors that will allow us to feel good about ourselves. Okay, so these 2 types of attributions, situational and dispositional, we tend to use these in particular patterns. Okay, One of them we saw on the previous slide, and I'll actually kind of a little bit of both of them. I think we've seen on the previous slide. So, two patterns of interpretation that psychologists have noted that we tend to use. One is called the self-serving bias, right? And again, this is the tendency to make our attributions so that we see ourselves favorably. This means we overestimate dispositional influences on positive outcomes, right? Why did you ace that test? Oh, because you're super, or because I'm super smart, right? We overestimate situational influences on negative outcomes. Well, why did you bomb that quiz? Well, the teacher made it really hard and they were just being mean that day, right? We tend to explain things in ways that make us feel good. Um, Another way of thinking about this, right, is the fundamental attribution error. And this has to do with how we explain other people's behaviors. And well, we tend to overestimate the situational influences on our own behaviors, we do the opposite for others, and we tend to overestimate internal dispositional influences. In other words, we tend to attribute the behaviors of other people to who they are rather than the situation that they are in. Right. And so these two patterns of misinterpretation, I think, are a little bit of the flip side of each other. But in both cases, they, I think, can help us maintain a kind of sense of self and a positive view on our own actions. Last thought about this, why do we have this self-serving bias? I mean, in some ways you might think about, well, we seem to all be walking around slightly deluded about ourselves, looking at ourselves through rose-colored lenses. But social psychologists actually argue that having a self-serving bias is important for protecting our self-esteem. It can help us own our accomplishments. It can help us move past our failures. And it also protects us from feeling worthless and powerless within our own lives. Something that's interesting is that people who suffer from depression tend to display the opposite of the self-serving bias, right? They explain all of their failures as the result of their internal characteristics, and then explain all of their successes uh, through situational attributions, thinking about external factors like, oh, I just got lucky, right? And you can think a little bit about like why it might be helpful to you, or how having a slight self-serving bias might help you move past something bad that happened to you, and how it might have helped you step forward into something better. So we'll talk more about this when I see you all next week. But there it is, attribution theory.